Well, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to our Policy and Practice seminar hosted by UCL's Department of Political Science. My name is Julie Norman. I'm an associate professor in the department, and I'll be your chair for this evening. Tonight's topic is, of course, Syria, what's next? For those of you who are here tonight and for those of you who follow the Middle East, I'm sure you're aware this is a major moment for Syria, for the region, at this major crossroads since the fall of the Assad regime back in December. Questions loom quite large regarding the future shape of Syria, regarding the regional plays revolving around non-state actors, and of course the pursuit of accountability for various human rights violations incurred during the civil war. So to discuss this topic tonight, we're joined by three panelists who I will introduce in just a moment. Before I do so, I just wanted to say a little bit about how this evening's program will work. Each speaker will provide some opening remarks, about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. We will have a pretty hard stop today by 7:15. One of the joys of having policy practitioners join us is they sometimes have to go and do that policy work even into the evenings, and that is the case for two of our speakers tonight. So if one needs to slip out early, it's certainly not out of a lack of enjoyment from the audience, but just because pressing things are happening alongside this panel. Just to say, the whole session, including the Q&A, will be recorded. So just note that if you are asking a question, you will be heard in the recording. If you don't speak, you will not. And finally, this event will be posted on the department's website and YouTube channel. So if you want to follow up on something afterwards, or if you have a friend or colleague who couldn't make it, that will be available afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to just introduce tonight's absolutely amazing panel. I'm so delighted that all three of our speakers could be here and that you can be here to hear from them. First, Mazen Ghariba is a research associate at the Conflict and Civil Society Research Unit at LSE. His work focuses on the role of governance during and after conflict with a focus on Syria. And in addition to Mazen's academic research, he also does a lot of policy work and also a lot of grassroots engagement as well. So he's a really valuable voice on the panel. We're so delighted to have him. To the left of Mazen is Sir John Jenkins. If you are one of my students who's interested in British diplomacy in the Middle East, John is like a face and a voice that you should certainly know. He has served as ambassador in the region to Syria, which is obviously on our topic today, but also to Saudi Arabia. Also to Saudi Arabia, to Iraq, to Libya, and served as the Consul-General in Jerusalem in his over 30 years of service in the Foreign Service in the UK. He's now the Joint Strand Leader for the Middle East at the University of Cambridge's Center for Geopolitics. So absolutely delighted to have you, John. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Borju Ocelik is a senior research fellow at for Middle East Security at RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. Her research focuses on, again, a broad range of topics, including non-state actors, extremist ideologies, and the politics of borders and territoriality in the Middle East. She previously worked for the United Nations Development Program as well, and is just an absolute top-notch analyst on the Middle East here in London. So please just join me in welcoming our panelists. And I'll turn it over first to Mazen to just kind of help us set the scene. How did Syria get to this point? What happened in December? What do we know about where things stand now? And any other comments you'd like to make?
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. It's a very difficult question when asked what's next for Syria. To be honest, as a Syrian, been working in Syria my entire life, the short answer is I have no idea. And I think no one really knows what's happening. But as you all know, as you all have seen on the news, the 8th of December marked a historical day for all of us. We all felt absolute joy and relief that the brutal rule of Bashar al-Assad has finally came to an end. The Assadist era, which lasted for 54 years or so, came to an end. But underneath that absolute joy and relief, there's this crippling anxiety about the uncertainty of the future. Post-Assad Syria faces formidable challenges, but at the same time, unprecedented opportunities that we didn't really have for the past 14 years. Over a decade of conflict, of course, that left the country deeply fragmented socially, politically, and in terms of governance. We all know the dire humanitarian crisis that's still ongoing, and a total economic collapse, and of course, a huge issue of displacement, mass displacement, and a legacy of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and gross human rights violations. I will try to speak about some of the major challenges ahead. Specifically, when looking at the macro political landscape, several issues emerge, which I believe the most important one is the fragmented opposition, military groups, and governance structures. Over the years, various political opposition groups and armed factions, each backed by different regional and international actors, have failed to unify under or even to agree about a coherent political agenda. Except for the downfall of Assad, as my father is saying now, Syrians agree that we don't want Bashar al-Assad, but we disagree on everything else. And this is exactly what's happening right now in Syria. In the aftermath of the Assad escape, these internal divisions have, of course, not vanished overnight. On the contrary, we are seeing increasing indicators that the political rivalry between different political platforms and armed groups are leading to stalemates in the transitional bodies or the newly formed institutions, including, and most importantly, the unified military institution, which at this moment seems like very ambitious, to be honest. The new internationally proscribed leaders of Syria, Hayat Tahrir Sham HTS, they tried to come up with a new agenda for a unified army. But unfortunately, given their history and their status, many armed groups are not convinced. There is also a deep mistrust issue with HTS, given its history of governing Idlib. So we're now seeing some of the military factions in the south, mainly backed by the Emirates, are not technically part of the new vision for a unified army. Of course, we also have the armed groups in Suwaida, which is the Druze community, are not also very convinced. They're not part of the new army. And most importantly, the issue with northeast Syria, the issue with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. They haven't reached any agreement so far. And all of these different factions and factionalism means that Syria is heading towards a future where there is no army. Institutions are nearly all collapsed. The economy is not functional. And it seems the international community is very reluctant to engage with the new leadership. Of course, a crucial dimension of Syria's post-Assad future lies in these geopolitical interests. As you all know, over the past decade, Syria was a proxy theater for states pursuing their own strategic goal. These geopolitical rivalries will shape Syria's post-Assad scenario. For instance, Iran will likely seek to maintain partnerships with the remaining pro-regime sympathetic militias, dominantly the Alawite community in the coastal areas. And of course, they're trying to safeguard some of their regional foothold inside the country. Through economic investments, cultural ties, and illicit security cooperation with some of the rogue armed groups in the coastal areas. On the other hand, Ankara's involvement has always been driven by its concern about the Kurdish autonomy along its southern borders and the movement, of course, of refugees. In the new era, Turkey is actively seeking to expand its trade and deepen security arrangements in northern Syria. At the same time, they're exerting leverage on the political negotiations between HTS and SDF through Turkey-backed military groups and some of the opposition elements which has historical ties to Turkey. Gulf states are clearly relieved that the stupidly stubborn Assad is gone, but and a seemingly more pragmatic leadership has taken over. But at the same time, there seems to be some sort of a political reluctance to fully engage in any reconstruction or early recovery efforts beyond humanitarian aid. They're also adopting a wait-and-see approach, imposing different, sometimes contradicted, political and security conditionalities on the new political administration. Syria's new foreign minister Mr. Shaybani is trying to adopt an ambitious, balanced foreign policy, engaging multiple partners in a matter that respects Syrian sovereignty and fosters economic growth based on their own kind of economic neoliberal vision of Syria, hoping to attract Gulf investors. However, if that approach proven to be insufficient in gaining trust in the new leadership, and if regional actors continues to back competing local armed groups, fragmentation would persist and violence will probably reemerge. I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm very optimistic about the future. That's why now I'm going to turn quickly to civil society and civic spaces, which always give me hope. The transition has led to unprecedented proliferation of locally driven civic initiatives across the country. We've never seen so much civic initiatives, local grassroots flourishing all over the country. These initiatives, they encompass diverse sectors and activities, mainly humanitarian relief, peace building, local dialogues, political and civil rights awareness campaigns. There are no traffic police. Traffic now in Syria is mainly regulated through volunteers. Yeah. Even in Umayyad Square, even in Damascus, the green zone, the bubble of Syria, the same, like traffic police are nowhere to be seen, but people are trying to take the matter into their own hands. Also, the same goes with garbage collection. People are taking the initiative to do so. I talked to someone who said, we're cleaning the streets because we want to start clean after Bashar al-Assad. So there is this momentum against civil society. And I believe there are three main reasons why these civic initiatives are flourishing all over the country. The first reason, as I said, there is this collective sense of civic responsibility among local communities to fill the vacuum left by the regime's collapse. All of them are reflecting a sense of urgency to maintain basic services and prevent the total disintegration of the state. The second, which I believe is the most important one, is that civil society actors are reclaiming their civic spaces, and they're reclaiming the participation of civil society in the public sphere, while emphasizing the role of civil society in the transitional phase in a very clear and ambiguous manner. They aim to limit the capacity of the emerging authorities in Damascus to suppress civic spaces in the future. So there is this sense among civic actors inside Syria that these spaces are open now because the current administration, they don't have the tools to suppress these spaces yet. So we need to occupy all possible spaces, all possible venues, in universities, in the streets, and public squares, all of that, in order to prevent them from suppressing these spaces again. The third reason is that these civil society actors are trying to impose their own vision on three main issues now. Transitional justice is the main component of civil society activism inside Syria. They know that if transitional justice mechanisms are not set in place, the sectarian-driven retaliatory violence will just increase, and they don't trust the current authorities to create their own judicial system or regulatory framework for that transitional justice. So they're trying to set the agenda at the onset, so they can have a saying in what transitional justice actually means from the grassroots. The second reason is that they know that at some point, given the past history of HTS and Idlib, when they were governing Idlib, the new administration will impose very strict regulations on civil society and associations. So they're trying also to have a new kind of de facto regulatory framework with the new government, basically saying we don't want to be registered, we don't want government approval for any of our activities. Our activities should be in a form of, in Arabic we say al-mukhabar, which is meaning the acknowledgement process, not an approval process. So we will acknowledge you that we will do this event in this area, but we won't wait for your approval to do so. And they're trying to get ahead of the new governments in setting the new rules. And of course, we've been seeing now more and more regulations from the new government trying to restrict these spaces, but they are so far they're failing to do so. There is this a huge momentum against, a huge momentum amongst all civil society actors that I know and I speak with. So they're trying to minimize the authoritarian tendencies of the new government. Just one of the main issue that's also facing civil society with the new government is that it seems so far that civil society actors has been systematically excluded from any official transitional arrangements. So the new government, they don't talk about the civil society, they talk about patrimonial society. They say al-mujtama al-ahli, which means the ascriptive groups are the ones who are really representing Syrian society. So basically they're saying this is the largest civil society in Syria is basically should be presented by traditional leaders, ethnic, religious leaders are the true representative of the grassroots, and civil society actors are trying to challenge this idea of patrimonial way of looking at the society by saying, no, this is not actually true. Civil society are also true representatives of the people in different sectors, and they should be included in all official transition arrangements. I will stop here and I will move to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mazen, for, I think, being very realistic about some of the challenges ahead, but also, I think, giving us some real insight into what civil society is doing, trying to get out ahead and reclaim that space, I think is, as you said, a bit of an optimistic note. So thank you for that. Mazen touched a little bit on some of the regional dimensions, the cross-border dimensions. Borja, I might turn to you next to fill us in a little bit more on that element.
Yes, so pleasure to be here. I think my plan is to provide a few observations, remarks, and then hopefully pave the way for Q&A and discussion. In terms of what next, as we have established already, I think it's a very fragile and fluid situation. And while there's a heavy sort of unjustified sense of skepticism, it's also, I think we should be there's also cause for some optimism, given first of all how recent this sea change is, and we mustn't be too hard on the caretaker government and then the peoples of Syria. And this is such a transformative moment, but a very fragile one and a dynamic one. To respond to your question, Julie, about the regional actors and their roles. So if I can start with Turkey. And we've heard in the press that the driver of the type of coverage we've seen is that Turkey has emerged triumphant, it's ascendant. It is somehow described or characterized as being the main influential external actor over Syria. And there are certainly in Ankara the view that this is very much the case, and there's a sense of euphoric sort of achievement. And the reason why some political circles inside Ankara believe this is because they feel as though they've invested in Syria in terms of taking in a lot of the refugees, and this has come at a great political cost for the ruling, the Justice and Development Party, President Erdogan, and so they feel as though Turkey is now both historically entitled to have a stake over the future of Syria, but also justified in making certain claims because of hosting this large portion of a Syrian refugee population inside Turkey. And of course, the second main point, as you pointed out, is the the terrorist threat as Turkey perceives it along its northern, inside northern Syria along Turkey's southern belt. I think there is the risk, and my sense inside the country is that there is a growing awareness that Turkey must be cautious about overplaying its hand, that trying to do too much too quickly might backfire. There are several reasons for this. One is that Syria is traditionally, historically, and from an identity point of view, part of the Arab Middle East. And Turkey is conscious of this and understands that there are structural constraints to how far it can influence the future of Syria. This, in my view, is not necessarily a bad thing, and it certainly can serve the interest of Syria in terms of Syrian agency in defining its future trajectories. And I think the Turkish political actors involved on the Syria file have been actively encouraging the caretaker government, the HTS in Damascus, from early on, to pivot to the Arab world. The first foreign visit was to Riyadh, not to Turkey. And the embrace of the Arab world, of the new Syria, I think is very important, and Turkey is plugged into this. It recognizes this. There are also financial constraints in terms of what Turkey can pledge and what can commit to in the reconstruction and the recovery of Syria. And there, the understanding from Ankara is that the Gulf states primarily will take the lead on that when it comes. That leads me, I suppose, to the question of sanctions, U.S. and EU sanctions, which continue to have a crippling effect on Syria's ability to recover, to reconstruct, to begin on its new path, and the question of legitimacy, I suppose, of the existing sanctions system. The U.S. The Caesar sanctions, the primary and the secondary sanctions, deeply problematic. And then the fact that they are being used as leverage over the HTS, I think, is prohibiting any meaningful progress in the economic recovery. The EU, we're sort of pleased to say, I suppose, is outpacing the US in the speed of lifting some of the sanctions on key industry sectors in Syria, which is positive, but using this as leverage in not a very easily comprehensible way, I think is problematic. We hear about inclusivity and sort of voice for all of Syrians, and of course these are absolutely essential, but they're also very lofty, difficult to pin down goals, and without a tangible roadmap of what steps the new government needs to take, I think it's just very difficult to identify a clear path to when the U.S. can lift sanctions. I think the American perspective, my understanding of it is, and please do challenge me if you know otherwise, the American perspective seems to be very much that we're tapping out of Syria right now. But our regional allies, they can engage with the HTS if they want to and in the ways that they want to. But the problem with that is, well, it's difficult when the sanctions are there because businesses, entities are having to sort of come to terms with who is a sanctioned entity, and how do we act within this wider ecosystem, this web of sanctions that the U.S. and the U.S. mainly has in place at the moment. So that's a problem. I think whilst these other objectives of a constitutional timeline of elections are very, very important, the day-to-day reality is Syria is broken by war and needs as much help as it can get in terms of economic recovery, and that's the reality, and it's maybe not the sort of romanticized. We need to get inclusive constitution tomorrow. Well, it's difficult, right? This only happened in December. We're still very early days. The HTS, of course, is a fascinating case study. It promises to be a very fascinating case study in terms of the rebel group transformation literature. Perhaps this is covered here in your courses. This shift, the transition to a pragmatic governing entity away from a Salafi jihadist one, how far can they take that? I think there's been a fair amount of the correct sort of messaging in terms of women's rights, in terms of other communities in Syria. Of course, these don't go far enough. There's been some backsliding, problematically, as you mentioned, particularly as we've seen in its response to civil society and democratic participation. But if we see this, if we zoom out and take sort of certain milestones into consideration, overall, the report card isn't that terrible, I think, since December. And I know there's a high level of skepticism in London and when you're in DC, but when I speak to others in the region, I think the message that you get is that Syria succeeding is so important and will have ripple effects, positive ripple effects across its borders. And there's the not too distant history of the failures of Iraq. That's still fresh in the minds of many. And so it's important not to repeat those mistakes. And so Syria succeeding is important and it matters. And we have reservations about HTS, its lineage of ideas and its ideology, certainly in the activities, the violence that some of its members, including the leadership level, have been involved in. But right now, the trend seems to be towards a level of pragmatism that we haven't yet seen in other similar groups. And this is a positive indication. I think the question of Iran comes up a lot, and you pointed to this, but what influence, if any, does Iran have at the moment in Syria? I think not much. Iran has been degraded, its influence severely eroded inside Iran, but is watching closely. I think the key, I suppose, takeaway would be that Iran might be down but not out, and that goes for Syria as elsewhere in the region. I think if we turn to Turkey again, Ankara is watching very closely what Tehran can possibly do inside Syria, the possible spoiler effect that it could play. And here particularly, of course, is whether Iran can create sufficient agitation amongst the Alawite population. Can it support an Alawite uprising from a distance? But bearing in mind that the Iranian physical access to Syrian territory has been cut off, and it's difficult to envision how that would change. One scenario is one where sanctions continue to harm the possibility that Syria recovers, and Iran then is able to develop inroads into the country. But we're not there yet. But in the scenario where the security situation continues to deteriorate or begins to deteriorate, that would be an issue. We've mentioned the question around, I suppose, power sharing and whether a federal model would be best suited for Syria. There's been some interest in this. Although, again, my impression from talking to those in Syria, I was there in January, and also regionally, is that, again, the lessons learned from Iraq. Do we want to replicate this model? Again, it's very, very soon. Of course, we have the Druze community in the south, southwest, the Kurds in the northeast. I think these are valuable conversations to have, and this will be part of the constitutional and the process. I think often what's missing, the missing part of this equation, is what do the Syrian Arabs want to see as the future of their country? And we often sometimes gloss over that demographic. That's not to trivialize or dismiss the legitimate claims of other groups for a different vision for Syria, but it does need to be an inclusive conversation, I think. And maybe I'll just conclude on the historic announcement that was made today by the imprisoned leader of the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, where he's called upon the PKK and its affiliates to lay down arms, and this chapter of armed resistance is now closed. And this has enormous implications for Turkey from a security and defense perspective, as well as regional countries, and most directly Syria, of course, and what happens next with the ambitions for autonomy amongst the SDF-led movement in northeastern Syria. And again, we already, even though it's been, I think, hours since the announcement came, there's been some skepticism around, well, will the PKK follow this order? I think, again, another significant demographic is how will Turkey respond to this? There's been questions around what the PKK is getting in exchange for agreeing to lay down its arms. So lack of transparency around what the terms of the agreement actually is. But again, it's a moment of optimism, I think, in terms of what this means. This ends potentially for decades of insurgency, and hopefully a better future for the Kurds of the region. So I will end on that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Borju, and just really amazingly comprehensive summary of how, again, the ripple effects out from Syria, what that means. And you touched a little bit on the international picture too, so I'll turn last to John, who, again, deep inside knowledge, deep regional knowledge, deep international knowledge. John, whatever you'd like to jump on first.
Thanks, Julian, it's great to be here. This point about Syria being a massive opportunity, that is shared here, shared in the West. This isn't just a regional thing. And it's a massive opportunity, not just because of the last decade or so of conflict, but because of the modern history of Syria, basically, since the Second World War. From the coup of 49, mostly Zaim, through the turbulent but pluralist, up to a point, 1950s, then the takeover of Syria, essentially, by the Egyptians of the United Arab Republic, then the Ba'ath coup of 63, and then essentially Hafiz al-Assad and the Alawite coup of Ba'ath coup of 1970. This is a 60-year period during which Syria has been, for all sorts of reasons, partly self-conceived, but also because of its relations with other states, an obstacle to moving anything forward in what I still call the Greater Levant. And that's huge. And I think the Iran thing is also huge, because if you're a regional state, and if you're the United States, if you're the European Union, what you're looking at is a moment when you wrest Syria from the grasp of Iran. And that was something that had already started to happen under Hafiz al-Assad and accelerated under Bashar, because Bashar, for all sorts of reasons, felt himself weaker. He was not as able to balance these forces as his father was. And that's huge. The question is, how do you now make this work? And for me, the essential element in this is the establishment of order within Syria. I was in Libya in 2011 during the revolution, and we started from Benghazi. Then Gaddafi is murdered savagely, which shouldn't happen to anybody. He should have been put on trial, and we moved to Tripoli. And I remember sitting. One of my last acts was sitting in a large meeting with the leaders of the NTC, and Ali Tarhouni, who was the finance and oil minister, said, "We don't need the international community. We'll do this ourselves." The trouble was the NTC did not themselves command power, the Weberian ability to exercise this to be the sole exercise of legitimate violence, and it fell apart very fast. And when a state falls apart, especially one with oil resources, and Syria does have oil and gas resources around Deir ez-Zor, it invites other actors in. We're already seeing this with Turkey, I think, and the Turkish thing is important. And clearly, there's an issue about what the coordination was between Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Turkey before they advanced through Aleppo down to Homs. But it's massively important. On the other hand, it's also potentially a destabilizing influence, because when we look back at what happened in Syria between, say, 2012 and 2015, we saw a variety of different states backing a variety of different actors. So the Saudis, for example, were backing forces in the south. They were backing the Jaish al-Islam with Zahan al-Aloush and his brother. The Qataris are backing the Muslim Brotherhood-aligned forces. The UAE trying to find non-Muslim Brotherhood-aligned and non-Jaish al-Islam-aligned people to back. The Turks were backing others up in the north, a variety of different actors, because they had a different aim. They wanted to secure the border and push back the Kurds, the PKK. And that's one of the reasons the thing fell apart. When I was ambassador in Syria, 2006, 2007, the thing that struck me was that 60 years, well, in the case, and then it was whatever it was, 40, 50 years of essentially Ba'ath rule, had hollowed out not just the state but the society. I mean, the Ba'ath Party itself was a shell, was a meaningless slogan which covered basically gangsterism inside the state. And your point about people organizing themselves to clean the streets, that is exactly what happened in Libya. I remember landing in Benghazi. There was no air traffic control. I went in on an Emirati Diwan flight with Jalil, Abdul Jalil, who was the head of the NTC. And you're driving through the streets, and there were squads of young people cleaning the streets up, which is something you see hardly anywhere. And that they themselves said, because we spoke to them, we're doing this because we want to own this space. We funded various civil society organizations, as did others. There was one in particular, a wonderful woman called Sarah Bergegas, who was a very, very impressive, dynamic lawyer. She ended up with 2 bullets in her head. I mean, this can happen. I mean, civil society is fragile. And unless you can impose order and exercise that order equitably, it's not going to, because other actors will be drawn in. On the other hand, I do think there is something in Syria which we did not see in Iraq. I think and I was ambassador in Iraq as well. The influence, I mean, Iranian influence in Iran goes back to the Safavids. I mean, it goes back even further. This goes back 600, 700 years, and the connection with the Shia in what the Persians, of course, in those days thought was Mesopotamia. This was part of the Persianate sphere of influence. Syria never was. And I think even Alawites, people talk about Alawites, the Alawites, generally on the coast, not just on the coast. Alawites are not naturally Iran-aligned. This is not, whereas a lot of the Shia groups who became the Shia militias in Iraq were naturally Iran-aligned for all sorts of complex reasons. I don't think that happens in Syria. And Syria is, by and large, I don't know what the figures are, 90% Sunni, basically. I mean, it is far more unitary in that way than Iraq. There's a famous Iraqi sociologist, professor of sociology, Ali Wardi, who wrote these fantastic books on the history of the sociological history of Iraq. And he talks about the duality of the Iraqi political personality. I don't think that's the case in Syria. I think the fault lines, there are fault lines, and I think any government that cannot bring the Druze and the Kurds in and the secular Sunni middle classes in is going to fail. Yes. Sharar clearly sees this, but he's going to need an extraordinary amount of backing, of coordinated backing from outside. It's great that he went to Riyadh, because I think the Saudis are critical to the success of this. Because the Saudis will look at this and see this is a chance genuinely to roll back Iranian influence, to reclaim Syria for an Arab consensus. And maybe Lebanon as well. And never underestimate the Saudi interest in Lebanon. It's huge. And now there's a new government in Lebanon, with North Salem, with Yusuf Aoun, and the rest of them. And they're saying, actually, now we want to be the sole exercisers of national sovereignty in terms of military. Those are connected. If that works, you then have the possibility of some sort of economic integration happening in that region, which is something you can't say for most other regions, certainly not for North Africa. There's just a final point I'd say, which is about Israel, because we haven't spoken about Israel, down in the south on the Golan. Of course, they have now moved into positions around Quneitra, yes, which is what they call the Galilee, down to the Jordanian border. And this is a continuation of the high points that they are occupying as well in the south of Lebanon. Now, I understand why the Israelis are doing this, and from a military point of view, but it's not, I think, sustainable in the longer term for them to stay, because they will become a target, and this will provide an opportunity to the Iranians to stir up trouble and to acquire allies and proxies who will act against them. And when that happens, if that happens, that will be massively destabilizing internally. Just one final point about money. People talk about, the Turks may think that the Gulf states are going to come in with massive amounts. I don't think the Gulf states have massive amounts of money, quite honestly, to spend on this, any more than they have on Gaza. I mean, you will all have seen, the wild video that Trump put out about Gaza. So there's Syria, there's Gaza, there's southern Lebanon, bits of Beirut, there's Sudan. I mean, so there was a meeting in Riyadh last week with the GCC, Jordan, and Egypt to talk about the plan for Gaza. The plan for Gaza, as far as I can tell from this, is for Egyptian military companies to come and do the heavy lifting and reconstruct Gaza, and somebody else to pay them. That's what the plan is. That's not a plan, it seems to me, because you have to get the politics right. And the same is true of Syria. I think Syria has a better chance of getting funding if they get the politics right than Gaza does at the moment. But that's a big question, and that comes back to the point about the domestic.
Thank you so much, John. So much to take in here. I have questions I can ask, but because our speakers are on a tight timeline tonight and we have a very full house, I will go ahead and open it up for audience questions, and I'll take a couple at a time, and we'll go from there. So if you have a question, please raise your hand high, and I'll try and get to you. Ozan, and yes, we'll start with 1, 2, and 3 there. So go ahead.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for this very insightful talk. So I'm Turkish, and I've been sort of following the PKK for years. I have seen, their ambitions sort of to create a Kurdish state, that type of thing, and the fact that Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, has called to disband is kind of like major. And sort of my sort of question is, in general, actually, is whether with this it's possible that Turkey can move to normalize relations with other Kurdish groups, or is it like, especially in regards to Syria? And the reason I say this is because there has been a move to, as you said, the military unification in Syria, but there's a question of whether the Kurdish ones can integrate with the, HTS. Like, is that is that going to happen? So, yeah. So that's my sort of area. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so we'll take 2 more. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. Dr. Öcalan, you were talking about how America was sort of tapping out, I think were the words you used, and I was just wondering, in terms of the sanctions they have on the Syrian industry, like, how will Trump's isolationism sort of play into that, and was that sentiment there before Trump as well?
Great, thank you. So we had a question on the PKK and the Kurdish element, a question on the U.S. and Trump and tapping out, and a third question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time. I just had a question. There's been a lot of discussion about potential directions that HTS could go as it moves into the government structure, and it's already done quite a lot of transformation in a relatively short period of time. I work on systemic republicanism in the UK, and obviously a lot of those groups splintered off from the provisional movement as they moved into a governance role. I'm just wondering, do you see any kind of potential pitfalls ahead with fragmentation of smaller groups?
Great, thank you. So the last question kind of on the fragmentation of the HTS and just potentially other spoiler groups emerging. Thank you, all great questions. So panel, any one that anyone wants to take on? Or
I'll take the first one if that's okay. Yeah. Thank you, Ozan, for that. I think today's announcement and what this might lead to, and there is buy-in to this, is my understanding. This didn't happen in a vacuum, right? So there's been build-up and certain buy-in from various groups. I think this will unlock a lot of opportunities and different arrangements, possibly. It removes the Turkish perception of persistent threat from the PKK, and that in and of itself will open up new opportunities for engagement and new potential arrangements in northern Syria, northeastern Syria for the SDF. The rebranding of the Syrian Democratic Forces with the PKK and their sister organizations in northeastern Syria might allow Ankara to justify engagement on a different level. So we mustn't underestimate the influence of the impact of the rebranding aspect of this, right? With the PKK out, Turkey will now no longer be able to say that there is a persistent existential threat to them along Syria. The hope is that the relationship can be akin to what Turkey has established with Iraqi Kurdistan. They are not one and the same, of course. The Kurds are not, as you will know, a monolithic group. They do not share the same ideology or governance models or aspirations or outlook on sort of economic integration or where they stand in the global order. But it's a very important step.
Can I add something to that? Because when I was ambassador to Iraq, actually, Burcu's father was my Turkish opposite number, the excellent Turkish ambassador in Baghdad. And in those days, Turkey had actually a very effective Kurdish policy, particularly in northern Iraq, and basically it was designed to try and integrate with a certain amount of stealth economically northern Iraq into, which of course, is something that goes back to Lausanne and blah, blah, blah. And it worked. And there were very good relationships between Ankara and the Barzanis, also the Talibanis, and indeed some of the Sunnis that are coming out of Nineveh. This is actually a model. Then it all fell apart. It fell apart partly because of domestic Turkish politics, which is also that's also a factor in all of this, how this works in terms of Erdogan's desire to stay, blah, blah, blah. I think the Barzanis and also the Taliban, Bafel Talabani has been speaking at the Erbil conference just now, and saying that he welcomes Öcalan's letter. The Barzanis have already welcomed it because they don't want this to kick off in northern Syria. It's very close to Erbil, and that's a very sensitive area. So there is something you can work with there. But I do think a lot depends on how Erdogan sees it in terms of domestic politics.
Just a quick comment on this as well, because this is very important. I totally agree with Dr. Burju on Turkey is the lifeline for Syria for a long time. And I truly believe that when Turkey says that we don't have an issue with the Kurdish population in Syria, I think that's true, to be honest. I think the only issue is from a national security perspective is this kind of militant transnational ideology of the PKK. And I believe it's in Turkey's best interests to have a solid relationship and a stable country at its southern borders. So I believe, yes, there is a huge possibility, as Dr. Burju said, for a Turkey normalization with the Kurdish community in northeast Syria. And by the way, this is key for the future of Syria as well. The last revenge of Bashar al-Assad was escaping the country without a political agreement. And I believe that the political agreement that will shape the future of Syria is the political agreement between Mazloum Abdi and Ahmed Shara, between HTS and SDF. That will be the basic kind of entry point for that. And I think Turkey knows that, and they're pushing for that direction. So I don't think Turkey is a spoiler in this, but I think they're exerting certain pressure, for other purposes. But yes, I see Turkey will be normalizing relations if the PKK influence was really reduced. Now, with regard to sanctions, there are a lot of things to discuss about sanctions, but I would say that lifting sanctions is a must, regardless of anything else, to be honest. When we talk about U.S. sanctions, people usually refer to Caesar Act. U.S. sanctions started in Syria since the 70s, by the way. The harmful sanctions on Syria were not just Caesar Act. They were the Syria Accountability Act after the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri, the Prime Minister of Lebanon. And of course, Caesar Act was the latest iteration of these sanctions. I would argue that there are no more legal basis for any of these sanctions, because if you read the conditionalities of most of the sanctions, including the US and the UK sanctions, basically they're saying that we're imposing these sanctions to change the behavior of the Syrian regime, specifically Bashar al-Assad, to engage in a meaningful political process. Bashar al-Assad and the regime is gone. There is no political process, so there is no legal basis for the sanctions anymore. In addition to, of course, that we need to lift sanctions for economic growth, I will also reflect back on the issues of democratization, civil society, and all of that. Syria is literally dark. I'm not exaggerating. During the night, it's like Gotham City. Damascus, the capital of Syria, during night, the lights are the lights from cars. There are no lights, and there is no electricity in Syria. And I'm not kidding. My family lives on 2 hours of electricity in one day. You cannot create politics and democracy in the dark. I can show you pictures of gatherings like this, hundreds of Syrians gathering in similar auditoriums, discussing politics and democracy and constitutions using their phones to see each other, because there are no electricity, there is no heating. So we need democracy cannot be built in the dark. So that's why we need to lift sanctions, all sanctions, by the way. And we were advocating for the formation of sanctions, not just now, for a while now, because I believe sanctions harm people more than they harm governments, but this is a long discussion. With regard to the fragmentation of HTS, this is one of the main questions Syrians are asking themselves. One of the experts in HTS a colleague of mine. He basically is following HTS internal dynamics. During the last battle after Aleppo, a lot of HTS fighters were not prepared for what's coming next. So HTS created something they called the مجموعات فتاوى الثغور, so the fatwa groups for the fighters, where all HTS fighters will send questions to these groups and HTS leadership will answer them. When you look at these questions, and some of these questions were leaked and I looked at some of them, they were asking questions like, what is a civil state? Does it contradict an Islamic state? Who are the Alawites? Are they Muslims? Are they Syrians? All the answers were very positive answers. So HTS is trying to prep their soldiers, basically saying, yes, the civil state doesn't contradict an Islamist Sharia law or any of that. A Sharia law could be embedded in different formations. Alawites are Muslims. They're part of the Syrian community, Christians as well, and all of that. That's positive, but also it is an indicator about the rift between the top of the pyramid, which is Shara and Shibani, which I genuinely believe they abandoned transnational jihadism years ago, even before declaring their divorce from Al-Qaeda, way before. But the rest of the pyramid is what's worrying. I believe they're trying to keep them in place, and so far they have been successful in doing so. One example that's really difficult to explain, that's I'm from the city of Homs. Homs is the largest mixed city in Syria. It has a huge, massive Alawite community, Christian community, and Sunni community. The Alawites, which understandably the most concerned among Syrians, they're demanding HTS fighters to come and guard their neighborhoods because they're not afraid of the HTS fighters. They're actually afraid of other non-state armed groups who are not as disciplined as HTS fighters. Most of the revengeful incidents are not committed. Not all of them. Some of them are, but most of them are not committed by HTS fighters. They're committed by other non-state armed groups, opposition armed groups who are not as disciplined as HTS fighters. But that doesn't mean there are some rifts, some fractions here and there. And it really depends on what's going to happen after the announcement. It should be in a couple of days, the announcement of the new inclusive government. The level of inclusivity of that government would mean a lot of stability for a country, specifically as Ambassador John said, when they also include Kurds, Druze, and other groups as well.
We have time for just a couple more questions. I saw it in the back and right here, please. Yes, in the back.
Okay, I'll just speak it up now. So the topic of Israel was mentioned very briefly, and I think that it deserves more mention because it's a major factor with what's going on right now. And also the way that it was talked about, I also think was unsatisfactory because the way it was talked about was more, when it was mentioned, it was described as a security issue for Israel and a risk of Iran being involved. But my question is, was it right for Israel to strike all military infrastructure targets in the country immediately the day after the government regime had fallen? Okay. And why was there not more coverage and outrage from the rest of the Western world, particularly, about that? And why is there ongoing... sorry, I'm just going to finish.
Yes.
Because I think it's important. Why is there ongoing lack of critique, especially of al-Julani or al-Shara, whatever he called himself, as he's seeming to allow his country to be annexed bit by bit by Israel? And if
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Thank you. So the question about the impact of Israel. Thank you. We're just short on time. That's the only reason. So there was a question here too.
Yeah, actually, I think it's continuous to the previous one, but it's what's the ripple effect of the transition on the rest of the Arab states, specifically Hamas? And could it ignite another Arab Spring, or is it out of picture?
Okay, impact on other movements, including Hamas. And did you have?
Yes, very briefly. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the role of the West in the region more broadly. Do you think they have a role to play at all? And perhaps that links a little bit as well, just to you speaking on how the caretaker government can perhaps develop their legitimacy some more in the country. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And we'll do pretty quick responses, I think.
So the issue of Israel is important. I mean, we have an hour basically to talk about these sort of things, and we could, if you like, just talk about Israel the whole time. But I mean, we are supposed to be talking about Syria, and for me, the impact, the immediate policy impact of all of this is how this affects the transition in Damascus. And if you look at what Shara and Shaban have been saying, they've actually been trying to dial this down. Because what they don't want to do, I mean, they said we have no quarrel with Israel, at least for the moment, though I think that if there is a different sort of state in Damascus, I think it will happen because there are, of course, land claims in the Golan and around Tiberias. And that's not going to go away, and that will be an issue. And that is a fault line in all of this that's happening. The point about an Arab, do I think an Arab Spring is going to happen? Another Arab Spring? No. I mean, so much does depend upon the ability of Shara in particular, and the people immediately around him, to stabilize the situation in Syria, because that's where everything else comes from. I think there may well be a read across into Iraq, and if you look at what these Shia militias, some of them, are doing at the moment, they are trying to dial the tensions down also remotely with Israel, because they don't want to be hit by the Israelis, to be involved in a conflict. We saw that during the advance on Damascus. And given that they will no longer be able to have, or at least for the foreseeable future, the same sort of close links that they used to have with Hezbollah, I think that also makes it possible to think about an Iraq where the Shia militias start to think more about making money rather than making trouble, which of course is what certain is happening at the moment. Do you want to?
Just very, very quickly, I think it's a very justified, legitimate question. Just to say that the more Israel bombs the south of Syria, the less likely it is that Shara and his efforts will succeed. I think it undermines the current government. It undermines the efforts at establishing order and stability, and that's an issue. And debating or discussing Israel's, I think, legitimate security concerns that could emanate from Syria, I think that's a different discussion to have. But in terms of undermining the Syrian efforts, I think that is a problem. On the question of Arab Spring, perhaps on democratization ambitions, I think Iraq is going to be next. I think we're going to be talking a lot about Iraq in the coming year, in terms of potentially going back to a question about U.S. interests, maybe not on the tapping out point, but what the U.S. envisions as its role. I think an uptick in pressure against Iran will go via Iraq, and we'll see that quite soon. That could mean the Iraqis shedding the influence of Iran, which has been sort of bearing down on them for a very long time now. And again, maybe sort of an optimistic point to conclude on for me is that the PKK, if this does materialize, if this does go ahead, democratization in Turkey, I think, will hopefully be upon us for all citizens in the country, with the terrorist threat sort of dismantled. So on that note, I will have to go, but thank you very much. My email address is on RUSI's website, so feel free to reach out to me with anything that you'd like to discuss, and thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to give Mazen just a chance to give us some final thoughts also before we wrap.
Yes, thank you so much for your question about the Israel occupation of new lands in Syria. By the way, when Syrians were celebrating the fall of Assad, as you said, Israel was carpet bombing a lot of areas. Actually, 2 days ago, when Syrians were gathered in the first national dialogue in 50 years, Israel was also bombing at the same time. And they are preventing a lot of advancements in the south. But I think the response, the right response, came from the Druze community, which Israel is now claiming to protect. Actually, the Druze community in Sweden declared that Israel is an enemy and we don't need their protection. We are Syrians, we're part of the Syrian fabric, and we can protect ourselves. So all the claims of Israel of protecting minorities and Druze minorities specifically, the response came from Al-Hajari, which is the religious leader of the Druze community in Syria. So there is no real basis for the Syrian for the Israel occupation, and of course it's very tricky for Ashara as well. You mentioned his nom de guerre, Al-Jolani, which literally means of the Golan, which he refers to the Golan Heights. So there is no appetite among Syrians to have any peace agreement with Israel without at least an democratically elected parliament to take that decision. It's not for Shara, it's not for HTS to take that decision, despite all of these regional pressure. With regards to the to another Arab Spring, I hope so, but I don't think so. That's my short answer. I mean, Syria was always given as a bad example. So you look at some of the Egyptian rhetorics from the Egyptian president Sisi. He always say, "Do you want us to be like Syria?" And now, actually, Syria is people are looking to Syria as a positive example of regime change. But I don't think there is a momentum after what happened in Gaza and after the genocides that was committed in Gaza and all of that. I don't think there is an appetite about this. But again, no one speculated Arab Spring in 2011, so we might never know. I hope there will be another pro-democracy movement along in different Arab countries, in Palestine, in Egypt, and elsewhere, for kind of the revival of pro-democracy civicness and social movements. But I think that will take a long time, and it might need different strategies than the 2011 Arab Spring. Maybe more long-term strategies of democratization in these areas. What we have to wait and see.
Great. Thank you so much. I know John also has another event tonight, so we will have to wrap up our event a little bit early, but I want to thank the audience for all the good questions. Before I thank the speakers, I just wanted to remind the audience about our next policy and practice event next Thursday on the topic of fixing the higher education system, which some students may be interested in, which is the final installment of our mini-series on priorities for the new UK government. If you don't follow us on LinkedIn or Instagram or Twitter, our handle is UCLSPP. And finally, please join me in thanking our speakers, Mazen and John.